Hello and welcome to this Podcast Plus, insight for best practice in bite-sized chunks. Today's session is on the essentials for video conferencing for employers and for partners, directors and managers to help them support their staff. My name is Neil Partridge, I'm the Operations Director at PDA Legal, and today I am joined by Samantha Aldridge, who is a Director at P&P Hub.
Hello Neil.
Samantha, could you explain to us what we're going to be covering today?
Sure. So on the screen in front of you, this is a list of kind of things that hopefully we will discuss today. It's really designed to give some useful and practical tips for consideration when video conferencing, managing staff video conferencing, and data protection issues for employers. If you don't mind, I might just launch in, Neil. So before we get into the regulatory considerations, can we just discuss some practical things? People are working from home, possibly for the first time, around family and friends. The biggest issue, I think, is trying to keep things confidential.
Yes, I would agree. We've all of us have spent decades getting used to the idea of leaving our front doors in the morning, going into an office, going into a building, going to a place of work, and you leave home behind for a few hours. What we're all finding now is we are thrust into an environment where there is a complete smudging of work versus home. And it's all taking place in the same place, isn't it? So yes, there's productivity. How's that been affected? But as you say, how has confidentiality been affected? Because it will have been affected. There's a few things straight off that employers, partners, managers, and directors can say to their staff. Is a basic rule: you really shouldn't be certainly holding a video conference, which is what we're focusing on today. You shouldn't be holding a video conference in front of anybody else. Video conferences are only for the participants; they are not for family and people around. So I would say a few things to think about straight off. Make sure your family are not in the room when you do this. I mean, once I even had to go to a broom cupboard to make a phone call to make sure that nobody could oversee or overhear what I was saying. Also, think about where you're working. Family's one thing, but are you working in front of a window? Could somebody walk past that window, the postman or postwoman or whoever it happens to be, and actually see what's on your screen? But another, perhaps more insidious and overlooked aspect are all the smart devices we've got in our houses right now. Things like Siri, if you're using Apple, or Alexa. There are reports now that people are receiving spam because smart devices have overheard them and they then send email spam to their email addresses. It's incredible how it works. So just make sure that Alexa and Siri are switched off, or better still, out of the room when you're actually working. Yeah, just gone if you can.
I mean, you've already mentioned working in separate rooms, but also just letting your family know that you're about to do a video conference or a call, and you're not to kind of be disturbed if possible. You don't want people walking in and passing you something like a cup of tea, but in the middle of a video conference, which may be the client, not just colleagues.
Yes, everyone is expecting a little bit of a more of a casual outlook. We are working from home, and of course our clients and our staff are going to be seeing a different perspective of us. But there are still some rules. It's still a business meeting, even if it's an internal business meeting. I've been on more calls than I can count recently, more video conference calls, where somebody's been slurping a cup of coffee. And we're all drinking more coffee right now, aren't we? But slurping a coffee or chewing on a biscuit or something like that. So there are possibly some basic rules that we can adopt. Yet do say to family, I have a little sign I put out on my door when I'm on a video conference or an online conference. Please don't disturb me. I would also, and this is number one, and you're going to recognise this, please mute your microphone if you're not actually speaking. Every single device in the world that video conferences has a mute button, and it's just I'm going to say it publicly, it's just rude to have for other people to be able to hear you shouting at the dog or chewing on some crisps. It's not necessary. You don't need to do it. So just to think about that. I think it's also important to bear in mind what people can see on your desk and around you. Some of these internet cameras now are really sharp and they can pick up all kinds of things. So where you've got it angled around to point at you, just think if it's a wide angle, it could be pointing in other places around where you're working, and other things may be seen on screen that you didn't want to be seen.
Confidential information, folders, labels, things like that.
Well, it's funny you say that. Just last week I was on a conference with somebody on a call, and I could actually see behind them the name of a client on a folder on the shelf behind them. Now, luckily, it was the name of a company, not a person. Still, there's confidentiality issues there. But if it had been a person, then potentially The act of video conferencing is processing personal data. By me seeing somebody's name on a folder behind them, that could be a data breach. It's certainly a data concern. And do you know what? Another one of my personal favourites, but on the same flavour, is the guy who decided to put a chrome teapot on Facebook or on YouTube, or no, it was on eBay. That's where it was, on eBay. But it did the rounds, eBay. And he took a photograph of it. And it was only later on that somebody pointed out to him in this shiny mirror-like kettle that his reflection was seen. And unfortunately, he was naked at the time that he took that photograph. Just think about how you look, think about what's around you, and think about what that camera can actually pick up, or that microphone can pick up.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. I think, it's happened to all of us. We all have IT issues and IT woes, but what could possibly prevent this, or at least try and minimize it, is taking some time before the video conference to
Yes.
check your internet, check your speakers, all of that kind of stuff.
I agree. We've all been there. The first 5 minutes of a video conference is somebody comes in late, somebody's microphone doesn't work, they can't hear you. We lose so much time and it's frustrating. Technology is going to catch up with this, but we all have to recognise this is a new medium for many of us. It certainly is a main conduit for our work. But I would say, as the host of a conference or a video call, you are responsible for briefing, giving advance briefing to the people who are joining you. Just tell them, guys, here's the platform we're going to use. Make sure you've got it uploaded on your device ready to use. Familiarise yourself with the controls, not least the infamous mute button. Make sure those headphones are working, because headphones are really better than speakers, especially if you've got somebody else in the house. Make sure your microphone's working. Make sure you've got a reliable internet device and internet connection. You know what? You can't always help being late. You may be working from home. Your dog might be sick in the corner of the room 3 seconds before you take that call. There's not much you can do about that. But 5 minutes preparation in advance saves so much frustration, and it's much more professional. And also, switch off any mobile devices or phones you've got in the background. Bottom line, and I've said this to everyone, you've heard me say this before, Samantha, just be fair to yourself, be fair to the person presenting, and be fair to your colleagues and clients. We're all having to adapt to this. Just prepare in advance. It's so much better for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, prepare as if you was attending a face-to-face meeting, I think.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
a lot of these video conferencing facilities have a testing facility that you can do in advance, I think.
That's right. I mean, most people are, yes, I mean, we might touch on Zoom a bit later, but platforms like Zoom, Join.me, some people are using WhatsApp or Messenger. You can conference on all of these devices. There's 30 to 40 different devices out there. Every single one of them you are able to try and test for free first. So take 30 seconds, 5 minutes maybe. Just do that test before you go on for the first time.
What do you think about people who are trying to kind of manage these video conferences with huge numbers of people, more than you would probably have in an office meeting?
Be realistic. Be realistic, I would say. I mean, where we're talking about conferencing, and I've been on some of these, where someone's attempted to have a business meeting with 30 people attending, it's just not going to work, and not work at least as efficiently as you might like. I've never been to a business meeting where I've attended with a bit more than maybe a dozen people sat around a table, and even then sometimes getting a word in edgeways can be difficult. The people who are participating have got to realise, there's an etiquette there. Be fair, be fair to your host, but the host should also be fair to the audience. Even if it's a small number, but especially if it's a large number, establish the agenda. Distribute the agenda in advance, including which platform you're going to use, and remind everyone to test their device before they come on. But set the agenda. If you've got 5 or 6 items to cover in an hour, then set some time frames. The first 10 minutes we're going to cover subject 1, and then the next 10 minutes subject 2. However you're going to do it. If you think people are going to want to contribute, then perhaps say there'll be a small amount of time allowed for a Q&A after each of the segments. Or perhaps say to guys, everyone here, the etiquette is, if you want to break into the conversation, bearing in mind, of course, your microphones are switched off unless you want to speak, message me, message the host through it, and we'll break what we're saying to allow you to speak. But I think bear in mind as well, there comes a point where if there are so many people on the call, you're just going to have to accept that it's probably going to be a one-way conversation. It's going to be a monologue rather than a dialogue. But again, be realistic and plan it in advance as best you can.
Yeah. So obviously moving on to protecting sensitive information during video conferencing. So It's obviously very important for business owners to be aware of how data is being processed,
Sure.
but how video conferencing plays a role in that.
It's now a huge role, isn't it? I mean, we talk about sensitive information and protecting that. Yes, there are commercial sensitivities. You may be talking about a product or a service that you need to keep confidential. But bear in mind that when you video conference, you are also potentially processing personal data, and there is legislation and regulation governing that. The GDPR, and also, of course, if you're a regulated industry, such as solicitors with the SRA, you may find that that regulator may be very interested in how you're doing things as well. So there are certainly controls that you need to have in place and to be able to demonstrate you're trying to do this right.
I mean, I think staff using applications that are possibly not authorised by the firm would be a big consideration.
That staff shouldn't be using applications that are not authorised by the firm, full stop. They really shouldn't. A few things here, straight off the bat. I'm just going to be unequivocal about this. No member of staff working from home, nobody should be using Windows 7 to do work for your business. Windows 7, great platform, but it's no longer supported for security updates by Microsoft, which means it's vulnerable, and there are threat actors or hackers out there who know this, and they're preying on it already. They're already using this information. Don't forget that it was Windows 7, when a patch hadn't been applied, that the WannaCry virus attacked 3 years ago and nearly brought down the NHS. So just make sure you know what software your team are using. But let's talk about conferencing software just for a minute. I mentioned Zoom, didn't I, a little while ago? Did I see 2 million people or 2 million conferences a day are taking place on Zoom? It's a phenomenal number, but it's also what I call the lemming effect. Just because 2 million people jump off a cliff doesn't mean you've got to follow it. Zoom's a good application, don't get me wrong, but as the owners or the chief exec of Zoom confirmed the other day, it doesn't have end-to-end encryption. What does that mean? It means that if you're sharing documents through the internet, they may not be secure. That's the first thing. The other one that's being used a lot is WhatsApp. Again, great platform, but bear in mind WhatsApp is part of the Facebook group. Therefore, even though you may be WhatsApping, conferencing somebody in the next town in the UK, the conduit is owned by businesses in the United States. And some of that, we don't know, some of it may find its way outside of the UK. Now you've got a real data protection concern potentially. But there's also facilities like Dropbox. When I'm dealing with clients, I don't use Dropbox, I use something else. I use the Safe4 system. But Dropbox, the paid for version, which I have, will comply with the GDPR. The unpaid for, the free version, probably doesn't. So if you're asking staff to share things by Dropbox, do you know which version they're using? In a nutshell, to everybody, read the small print first. Understand whether it complies with the regulation which applies to this country, which is the Data Protection Act, and make sure that your staff are only using authorised applications. If they're not, I'm just going to be blunt and say it, if they're not using the authorised applications, no matter how desperate, they really shouldn't be doing work on those devices for you. End of story.
I mean, what about recording video conferences? There is facilities on these video conferencing systems to record.
Ooh, well, that's a big data protection concern. You're right to think of that one for sure. I've been on conferences where I've suddenly found that my conference participation has been recorded. Let's go back to basics on this one for a minute. If you record somebody's name, if you record somebody's name on a screen, if you record somebody's voice, you've got personal data belonging to them. Now, you might say, well, that's okay, they're an employee, I've got their personal data anyway. But and here's the geek in me coming out now, under Article 30 of the GDPR, you have to know all the different kinds of data you're processing and why. Now, it may be that you've considered you're processing employee data for appraisals or to manage them, but you may not necessarily have considered the risks in recording their personal data during a video conference. So it's very important that you have those controls in place. It's also important that you tell people before you start recording that you are going to record the call or the conference, the online conference. And bear in mind that you might not be able to force them to allow you to let you record them. So again, you need to seek guidance on this and be very, very clear about it. So if you're going to record it, make sure you record it in the right place. Make sure that you've got the appropriate controls in place. Make sure you know what's happening with the personal data. But first and foremost, let the participants know. You may even have to ask for their consent before you record it. Be very careful.
Who would you say is responsible for maintaining information security and data protection whilst people are working remotely?
Okay, here's the bombshell, everybody. If you participate in one of these online conferences or one of these video conferencing, you as the individual employee, you are responsible. Ultimately, your employer is going to be what's known as the data controller. They are responsible ultimately for what happens to data being processed as part of their business or organisational operation. And they will take responsibility, but so do the people who are participating. So if you've got a member of staff who's on a web conference and a video conference, and they've got a client's name on a person's name on a piece of paper, that's visible on the camera, that's on their desk. That's not relevant to the conversation you're having online. If a family member is sat in the room at the same time, you are potentially causing a breach of personal data, and you as an employee are responsible. So bottom line, tell your staff, yes, as an employee, as an employer, you are with an overall control, and you will tell your employees what they must and must not do with that personal data. But tell your staff that as employees, they are also personally responsible.
Yeah. I mean, I think it might be useful now if we just kind of sum up what employers can do to minimise the issues that we've raised here. I think a big one probably is perhaps having a remote working or home working policy, setting out what's expected of staff.
Have a policy. I mean, even just a few simple rules. The important things like make sure you're in a private space. Don't do it in front of other people. Maybe some rules that establish the etiquette. Use that mute microphone button, but also make sure that perhaps in your policy you set out how you're going to make sure your staff are using only the applications that you tell them to use.
Yeah.
Maybe the rules involved, maybe tell staff you must not hold these conferences in front of other people. You must not have things behind you which can be read that could betray confidentiality. Maybe go as far as telling staff, okay, you must now sign and return this set of instructions, this policy, to prove or to demonstrate that you've read and understood it, and be prepared to hold staff to task if they then go against those rules. Keep a copy of that on their personnel file, because if things do go wrong, and for some organisations they definitely will go wrong, regulators will eventually come knocking on that door, insurers may be involved, and the ICO may become involved. One of your best lines of defence is trying to provide evidence to demonstrate you trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And one way of doing that is to say, I've got a copy of staff saying that we were told the staff, they told us they understood what they needed to do.
Yeah. Unless you've got anything further to add, I think that's probably it. Neil, what do you say?
Well, I could go on for hours. I'm sure we probably both could, but no, it's been really useful, I think, covering these key aspects. So thanks very much, Samantha, for this session.
Yeah, and thank you for everybody who's listening today. So on the screen, hopefully in a few seconds, we're going to show you what other podcasts we are doing or have done. So please do visit the PDA Legal website where you can find further information on those. You saw our contact details right at the beginning of this session on the slide, the first slide. So please do contact us if you have any queries on what was discussed today. And thanks again for listening.